Good morning. Thank you all for coming out to meet Rob Califf, former FDA Commissioner under President Obama and Verily Science Advisor. I'm Paul Varghese, the Clinical Lead for Health Informatics for Verily Life Sciences. And today we're going to have a question and answer session with one of the most influential physician scientists in the United States in healthcare and internationally. And I'll be asking Dr. Califf about a range of topics related to tech-enabled healthcare, and there'll be an opportunity for the audience to also ask questions as well. So for those of you who may not be familiar with Verily, we are an offshoot of Google X. We've been around since 2015, and our mission is really closely aligned with what Google has. We would like to make the world's healthcare information accessible and useful for the population at large. And we do this in a variety of ways. One is to collect information, organize it, and then make it actionable. You may have heard of some of our recent efforts in this field, which is some of our more prominent public projects. One is called the Baseline Project, which is to enroll 10,000 people to collect evidence in a way that the world has not seen before, a broad range of healthcare information which we consider traditional and non-traditional, things like behavioral information, activity information. Another more recent initiative is in the disease management space. We recently have a joint venture that was launched with Sanofi called Onduo. It's for diabetes management initiatives. And it's, again, trying to apply the best of what we know as a Google and Alphabet associated company to the area of healthcare, which we think is ripe for improvement with some of the technologies we take for granted. That's a little bit about Verily, and with me is Robert Califf, who's one of our Verily Science Advisors. There could be a whole separate talk about all the things that Dr. Califf has done, but I will hit the highlights. He is a physician scientist. He's a cardiologist trained primarily at Duke University, where he spent the last 30 years becoming one of the more prominent medical researchers. I think the blurb that I read was 1,200 peer-reviewed journal articles, 50,000 citations, and that just shows the kind of work that he's done. It's particularly meaningful to me. I'm trained as a cardiologist, and when I did my training, we learned Dr. Califf's works. And one of them was one of the most prominent large-scale clinical trials that gave us true evidence-based medicine. It was called the Gusto trial. And when we talk large scale, I mean large scale, 40,000 people. And Rob will have some opportunities to talk about what it was like to sort of do that kind of evidence generation and data collection in the era when the most sophisticated technology was a fax machine. Those are some of the reasons why he was tapped by President Obama to help run the FDA. For those of you who are not familiar with the FDA, it is the agency that is tasked with ensuring the safety and efficacy of the medications and medical devices that we take for granted in our lives. I think the blurb from Forbes was that Rob Califf was the most qualified FDA commissioner in the history of the organization, given that sort of wide-ranging background that he had. And for all of those reasons, I've asked him to come here and talk a little bit about what it's like to be a clinician, scientist, educator, and be on the government side of things when we are trying to find new and innovative ways to apply technology to healthcare. So that's the background for Dr. Califf.
Thanks.
Why come to technology? You have been on the government side, you've been on the clinical side. What is it about coming over to the technology era or technology sector that you found appealing? And the related question is something that Eric Schmidt posed to us about a year ago, which is how does a technology-centric company such as Alphabet, such as Google, such as Verily, learn to become more healthcare-centric?
Well, so first of all, let me just say I'm hedging my bets, as you know. So I'm half-time at Verily and half-time back at the old university in North Carolina. And I'm also chairing the board of an organization called the People-Centric Research Foundation, which is an effort to generate evidence on behalf of patients and consumers about health policies and medical products that has been funded through the Accountable Care Act, actually, and now we have 130 million Americans participating through the use of their health records and hopefully in clinical trials. So I see it as a comprehensive effort, but why spend, at age 66, spend 2 weeks in North Carolina and 2 weeks in California? Seems like an extreme thing to do. And the answer is because, obviously, to me, the technology sphere is taking off now and has a huge amount of money. So on one hand, we got tremendous talent, a revolution in technology, and then we've got a country, maybe exemplified by the Southeast and Middle America, where life expectancy has gone the wrong direction 3 years in a row. So, we should be concerned about the world, but we'd better be concerned about the United States because our health is deteriorating measurably under our feet. So what I would hope to do is to bring these worlds together, because the traditional healthcare sphere needs better technology, and amazing things are possible. But the tech world has failed every single time it's tried to get into this space. And there are reasons for that, which have to do with the human side of things that are, I think, fundamentally different between software development and application to a very human thing like delivering healthcare and people making decisions about their healthcare. So, at this stage of my career, I want to be helpful, and I'm trying to keep a foot in each side of the equation.
So I'm going to ask you to play the role of physician. You're used to giving patients constructive information that can be tough to hear. What kind of constructive, tough medicine would you give to an organization like Google, Alphabet, and Verily? You mentioned the differences in how clinical medicine is done in software development.
So part of this, the part I'm very confident about giving advice on is pay a lot more attention to the human side of things. The best software in the world when it comes to people making everyday decisions about health will not do the job unless it's integrated with people. An individual, it seems like a lot of what Silicon Valley is built on is an individual interacting with a computer, which is, it's been great for me in my career. But when I make decisions about my health, often my wife is involved, my parents may be involved, and for many things, by law, I've got to deal with doctors and nurses and clinics and hospitals. So it's a complicated social human equation that needs to be dealt with. The part of it I'm a little less confident about. I'm sure that this is an issue that we need to pay attention now. It's just looking at what's happened with Facebook. You cannot assume that using people's information and selling it without a very strong governance, probably regulatory eventually, approach is going to be needed, because ultimately this is I think, a very powerful double-edged sword that if it's not handled through channels that have governance, could end up being detrimental, as I think this last election was. Certainly wasn't good for my career. I was out of a job January 20th.
So you talked about, you touched on the role of what we do with people's data. And so one of the promises, or one of the potential promises, is that as we do better data collection, that we have the advantage of technology being fairly ubiquitous, that we have sensors that we're all carrying. They're smartphones. We're gathering information, and we want to do the right thing by the patient. We want to do the right thing by the provider. Can you talk a little bit about where you see how we empower people to get that information? For example, you were recently at South by Southwest talking on this very subject. Can you share where you think the obligation is to getting that information back to the patient? And do we not run the risk of overwhelming people? More information is not necessarily easier to manage.
A lot of wisdom in what you just said, in my opinion. This goes way back for me. I mean, we were doing studies in the 80s of end-of-life care, and pretty easily demonstrated that different people will take exactly the same information and make very different decisions, oftentimes kind of shocking. Like, there was a general view that if you had like a 1% chance of living the next 6 months, that people would rationally say, don't resuscitate me, because it's just going to add a couple of days of misery to and I'd rather die peacefully under good social conditions. But a lot of Americans will look at 1% and say, I'm going to be the 1%. And often the families would have opinions about it. So we've also got to look at the cognitive capabilities of the population. A very high proportion of Americans, something like 15%, can't read above a second grade level. So the idea that we're going to empower people by giving them like their genome in that circumstance it just doesn't make sense. On the other hand, you should get your genome. So I think one of the beauties of what could be done with current technology is to tailor the information to the person according to their capabilities and desires, also taking into account that they need to have a relationship with if it's someone particularly who has an illness or a serious finding, needs to have a relationship with a clinician of some type and a system. And like I say, very often with family members. I love the British term for this, carers. So a carer is someone who's not paid but takes care of you. A caregiver is someone who is paid, like a nurse or a social worker. And those things are different because the carer often comes with a very emotional component. You know, it's been said that in American families, the women make about 80% of the healthcare decisions, and I think that is verified by empirical research. So on average, if it's a man, if you're not dealing with a significant other in a heterosexual couple, you're probably making a mistake on average.
You talked about some of the new demands we're placing on patients when they get access to that information and the people surrounding them. If that is changing for the patient and the people around them, where is this going to impact the people we traditionally associate, the caregiver, the physician, the nurse? That there are things that we associate with those roles and responsibilities. In 2012, there was a lot of attention to what Vinod Khosla said about he didn't want to see Dr. Varghese or Dr. Califf, he wanted to see Dr. Algorithm. And then 4 years later, he kind of backtracked and he said, well, I think there's a role for the physician, but I think it's going to be like 20% physician, not like 100% replacement. And so the question for you is, from your vantage point and perspective, both as a physician and an educator, where do you see the role of physician evolving? And I ask in particular because your son is actually doing his medical training in emergency room medicine. So what is it that you're going to see happening to your son and other people in their training with this?
Well, one thing you learn at the FDA in a big way is that when people are healthy, they really do behave like consumers. And that is very little risk tolerance, a lot of desire for independence, particularly in Americans. It's a little different in other cultures. But when people get sick, they become dependent fairly quickly. They're also willing to take more risk, and they're more vulnerable to people selling them things when they're at risk. And so I'm not worried about the role of the physician going away. I don't think that's going to happen. The physician becomes an enabler and an information transmitter. But there's also this other big thing happening, which is not, we use the word physician. That's really almost a metaphor for a clinician of some type. More and more, the clinician may be a nurse or a pharmacist or a physician's assistant, all kinds of people working in teams to help people take better care of themselves, and when the person desires it, making decisions for that person. For example, as a cardiologist, pretty rare to have somebody coming in with an acute heart attack making an argument about what treatment they want. You got 10 out of 10 chest pain, 30% chance of dying in the next couple of days. You're pretty dependent, and it's critical to have doctors that can make decisions for people and healthcare teams that can do that. On the other hand, if you're totally healthy and you're trying to decide which vitamin to take or whether to take a prophylactic statin, the locus of control is much more in the hands of the individual and the family. So the role of the doctor will change. The most in peril for their current roles would be those that look at images, so radiologists, dermatologists, because it's clear that machine learning can do better for the repetitive parts. But think about it. Right now, those people make their living, for the most part, looking at images serially. and producing reports, we have a big problem in translating the findings of those reports into useful actions. And there's a tremendous gap to be filled there for clinicians. So the jobs will just be different. But I would predict the better information we have, the more there's going to be a need for helpful people in healthcare.
That seems to be a natural segue to, for those areas that are more amenable to these applications of machine learning and technology, how reliable should they be? And who is the person, who are the organizations that should be in charge of those things? And I ask in particular because the FDA has the purview of evaluating medical software as a device. There are some things that are exempt, there are some things that are not exempt. And I think I, as a physician, have a lot of comfort and utility when I know that there's a tool that's reliable. I joke with my staff that I can answer nearly every medical question they ask me with one of three answers. We don't know, it depends, and my new favorite is, I don't remember. And I'm freely admitting that there are some things that are just I don't have time for, that I'm going to need to have a tool that helps me. But I know how to evaluate the safety and effectiveness of a drug or a traditional medical device, but I think we're really in uncharted territory when it comes to what we do with algorithms. And having sat at the highest seat in this arena, where do your thoughts come?
Well, I mean, I feel compelled to say my career started in 1975 with one of the first databases in medicine. Before the 1970s, everything in medicine was on sheets of paper and scribbled handwriting, as you may know, and I just was fortunate as a medical student to be in a place that had a database in cardiology that measured everything that happened to people as part of clinical care, as part of the clinical record, and then followed them for life. And so we had algorithms that were used in a predictive way back then for one very specific condition. And the first paper I wrote that was published in peer-reviewed literature predicted that within 5 years all diseases would be treated with the assistance of a computer, giving decision support with the doctor and patient looking together at the information. I was off by 40 years. We're still not there because it's such a vast enterprise and so much to do. But if we fast forward to my time at FDA, I'd seen this before, but at FDA you really see it. If you're really good in your field and you're very principled and you always do the right thing, it's hard to imagine that there are nefarious people in the world. And also that there are a lot of people who are well-intentioned but just don't get it right. And you see that at FDA, the mixture of those two. The proportion of nefarious people is actually quite small, but they can have very powerful negative effects. And the history of the FDA is catastrophic public health events that lead to regulation. So it started with a horse named Jim, milk wagon horse, who was being used to develop antitoxin, and the horse got infected and it killed some children in St. Louis. That was 1906. It led to the first Biologic Control Act. Then it was sulfanilamide. There was a company that put arsenic in antibiotics that were sold to children, believe it or not. Killed a number of children. So that led to safety regulation. Then there was thalidomide, which was being given as free samples to pregnant women to control nausea, and it caused horrible birth defects. That led to Kefauver-Harris in 1962. And it's amazing to think prior to 1962, you didn't have to show a drug was effective to put it on the market. And at that point, they reviewed 3,000 drugs that were being sold routinely in the United States that had no evidence that they had any benefit. They were all pulled off the market. So if you don't think there are people selling stuff that's bad. And then for devices, there was the Dalkon Shield, which was a pregnancy prevention device that caused infections. And let's just say the company that made it didn't necessarily come clean with all the adverse event reports in a timely fashion, so that led to more device regulation. So now let's think about decision support and algorithms. It's understandable there are a lot of smart people who say, regulators are in the way We can do this right. It's going to help people. We know we're good. And let's say that there's some decision support that a lot of people use. There's a little glitch in the program, so the wrong dose of the drug is recommended. You know, the cover right now would be to say, well, it's just decision support. The doctor makes the decision. But anybody that's been in a busy clinician's office knows that at 10 minutes a patient, you're going to use decision support if you think it's good. And so this is part of my meeting with Obama, just a quick story on that. When I got offered the job, people know I'm an enormous Duke basketball fan. I was captain of my high school team. I've had season tickets at Cameron Indoor Stadium for decades. And he spent the first 10 minutes of our one-on-one meeting in the Oval Office telling me how much he hated Duke and he loves UNC. And this went on for a while, but then we...
You mean like everybody here?
Yeah, you got it. I'd say Duke and the Red Sox have a lot in common. More the Patriots, probably, in terms of national hatred. But the last 20 minutes were literally about the importance of technology to the American people and how the absolute need to regulate it, but to do so in a way that fostered creativity and innovation and allowed this industry to thrive. And you know, I loved it, and I think there are ways to do that. It starts with saying that for now, the FDA is not going to regulate decision support heavily. It's going to watch it with something that's called enforcement discretion. The exception being if that decision support is attached to a real medical device that has consequences, like your cardiac defibrillator. You wouldn't want the algorithm to not quite be right with the cardiac defibrillator. So that's going to be regulated as part of a medical device. But, you know, should you take a statin decision support? What should you do with your blood pressure medicine? Should you get a flu vaccine? Not going to be heavily regulated. But I've predicted publicly, and I'll just say it again, there will be some catastrophes that will occur. And that's how we'll figure out what should be regulated. And in the meanwhile, one of the reasons that I came to Verily as part of Google is my belief that a company with these resources can afford to do it right. Because so often what you see, both in the academic world and in the industry world, is you've got a company that's just trying to skate by, minimizes expenses and get revenue as quickly as possible. There's a tendency to cut corners. And often you can cut corners and get away with it. It doesn't affect anything, but sometimes bad things happen. And, you know, this company can afford to do it right, and I think should not back off. I do want to say one other thing. Advertising is a big part of this company, and the role of advertising in all of this is a very complex issue that we better pay a lot of attention to, because advertising is how you will get products to people, both, as you know, doctors, just like any other human being, if they don't know about it, they can't use it. On the other hand, most of advertising now is being used to sell things that aren't so good for people's health. And I would argue it's one of the reasons that our health statistics are going backwards now. We're not eating well, and we're spending a lot of money on things that are detrimental to health.
I'm thinking about the flip side of that, that with those types of interactions that people have with those things that they're getting prompted to look at, is this not an opportunity to sort of look at that as information that can help us make better decisions? That there is this concept of sort of pharmacovigilance, which is after a product, pharmaceutical or medical device, gets released to the market, it's only then when we realize, you know, what is its true effect. Because when you're doing the trial, it's hard to anticipate everything, and that we get real-world evidence now with people interacting with the things that they're looking for and searching for. Is this not an opportunity for us to be able to look at that as a valuable data stream to help us, you know, maybe counteract, you know, some of the things that we're not able to anticipate now? At the same time, though, I think nobody has the right answer for like the level of privacy associated with this, and I'm curious where you see the benefit of that and the challenge of that.
Well, it is like the world's most important opportunity now to make a difference. You know, it's really fascinating. If you look at the health statistics, and we're going to have an amazing meeting of parts of Google and the Gates Foundation and Chris Murray, who produced these beautiful geospatial maps of the world. They've had a focus recently on the U.S. because we're looking particularly bad compared to other economically developed countries. And the breakdown of life expectancy and health status roughly looks like the election map. It's really fascinating. But if you go to the red counties where life expectancy is going backwards, mostly due to opioids, suicide, and cardiometabolic disease, which is roughly eating too much and not exercising. Everybody has a cell phone. Everybody has access to information. It's a question of what do we do with that information, and how do we include people in an active way that leads to better health. And maybe people in the room, there are a lot of smart people here, maybe people here have the answer, but it seemed to me that a lot of what's going on with the technology now is, I think of them as addictive circuits. It's, the neurobiology here is pretty complicated and not so simple. But most of it's built on immediate delight, and for almost everything related to your health, you need to have the opposite of immediate delight. You need to have executive function. You need to be able to say, no, I'm not going to eat that Bojangles biscuit from where I come from. That's a big deal. I'm going to hold off and maybe have one a week as a treat. But what the advertising is telling you to do is to eat the biscuit now, and when you do, it feels pretty darn good. And so, how do you engineer executive function using the technologies that currently lead to repetitive behaviors that are detrimental? That, I think, is a huge question. It's one of the reasons I came. I was hoping we could figure this out because it's not so obvious. But we got to involve people. And what I'm telling the university side is I don't know of anything more important for universities right now than to have serious academic intellectual activity about how societal expectations of technology. What should the rules of the game be that are good for society? You need policy schools, law schools, medical schools, English departments, history departments to come together and think this through. I'll say one other thing, because I sort of make fun of Davos. I went this year. It's where millionaires tell billionaires what the middle class is like. But one of the themes there is this fourth industrial revolution, which I think is very real. The first was water power, the second was electricity, the third was information technology. We're just recovering from that revolution. Now we've got the fourth, which is the merger of biological, physical, and information sciences into a single sphere. It's dramatic, and it has profound consequences for our country and for people all over the world. I think we've learned we can't just leave this to chance. We've got to have serious people think about how it should be dealt with.
I'm going to get to a couple other questions, but I just want to point out that this was Rob's official FDA portrait, and a couple of weeks after joining Verily, this is his official Verily portrait. So we got to him real quickly.
I noticed that Dr. Harrington sent you a Stanford T-shirt.
Yes. Yeah, we were trying for a UNC T-shirt, but it was last minute. So you introduced me to this concept, and I think it might be related to some of the things that you just touched on. It's like, how do we sort of view this information differently? And this is actually a University of Washington course, Calling Bullshit in the Age of Big Data. And apparently it's incredibly oversubscribed. So how do we teach people to sort of understand what's put in front of them now?
Well, I'm going to just talk about the health and medicine part of this. There's a whole other area in politics that we could spend a long time talking about. But, you could say the FDA's job, basically in society, is to call bullshit, but to do it with enforcement when it happens. And the problem we have is that if you just say AI or machine learning in much of academia now, people step back and say it must be great. But there's a lot of bullshit. And much of it comes from technically well-done things that just from people who don't understand things like confounding and lead time bias and context of the research. And it can lead to very tragic wrong answers, and there are many, many, many examples of this. What fascinated me in this course is it's in the context of big data of all types. It's a university course, not a health course. But essentially, the curriculum is what you would learn in Clinical Epidemiology 101 if you were in a school of public health or a medical school. It's how to understand context, how to know that you need the right teams of people who have a track record of producing reliable results. Not just accurate, but reliable for the purpose of the analysis, particularly if it's going to be used to make a decision or derive an action. And then there's having the courage to call bullshit, because when you do it, I mean, the great thing about the FDA, you get vilified every day by the press and by Congress, but you actually have the legal authority to call bullshit and do something about it. For people who are in everyday work and they see something going on in the workplace, this is very important for health research that's not right. People cutting corners. It's easier not to speak up, to not say anything about it. And bad things happen when that occurs.
So maybe you can hold us accountable. I think we're all familiar with the phrase dog fooding, that one of the things that is a tremendous asset for us in this company and in the alphabet sphere is that we have a ready, willing pool of people who are willing to try the newest, the latest, to contribute their information. How do we avoid sort of building in those biases? From your description, you were well versed in sort of looking for these confounding things, coming through old school methods of epidemiology. But for many of us, it's the lure of we have a ready pool, we can generate data quickly. What is it that you think that we should be paying more attention to when it comes to this? Especially, is this, it might be internally valid, but it's not externally valid.
Well, the other great thing about the FDA, at least in the drug and device arena, we didn't get a chance to talk about food and cosmetics and animal health, which is, the FDA regulates 20% of the economy, half of it is food. We could have a long discussion about that. I'll avoid that for now. But
I'm still thinking about the biscuits, sorry.
Yeah. By law, companies have to demonstrate that their products are safe and effective in prospective studies. And so in health, it's actually pretty easy, but you have to have the rigor and the courage to do it right. And that is, you can do all the stuff you want to do as you're developing your concepts and ideas. Ultimately, the test is a prospective study that measures health outcomes. And if your product doesn't improve health outcomes, you got to ask the question, why should anyone pay for it? And in many cases, the surprising finding is that there's actually a detrimental effect of something that you thought was going to be great. And there are many, many examples I could give, but I think the same is going to be true of information technology. It looks logical, it makes sense, it ought to work. Then you deploy it, and for reasons that you didn't understand, the wrong things happen. Now, if you're selling shoes, it's probably okay if people get shoes that are uncomfortable, they'll throw them away and buy some new shoes. If someone's making a life or death decision and they're now dead, you can't take it back, and you cause that. So it's a different game, but the beauty of it is do the outcome studies, figure out if what you're doing works, and involve people that don't have a financial interest in the outcome in the studies, which is another hard part.
It's one of these native tensions that we know that there are things that work well in the healthcare arena. At the same time, we want the advantages of what we know works well in our arena of technology, and that it is this sort of uncomfortable tension that we sometimes think the adage "move fast, break things" is the thing that makes us successful. But how does that translate into a more controlled arena where the consequences are much higher?
Like I said, I don't think anyone's solved this yet. There's a reason that Silicon Valley has failed almost 100% of the time in this arena. Okay. And part of it is this, you can't just take human lives and move fast. A brick in the face of a human being is not a trivial issue. On the other hand, taking 5 years to get an answer for something, a technology that can move faster, this is what President Obama was all over me about, is how to do this. And I think the key is informing people of what you're doing. So if you're going to develop a system that will figure out how to use technology quickly, make sure that the people who are getting healthcare in that system understand what you're doing. You're not doing it behind their back secretly. Back to Facebook again. They need to understand it and participate. That's why we don't call research, we used to call them subjects when you did research. They're like inanimate objects that you're doing experiments on. We now call them participants because they have a right, a human right, to be involved and to understand what you're doing and why you're doing it. I believe, based on what we're seeing in the baseline study that you mentioned, that if you do inform people, they'll be excited about it. They'll want to participate, and particularly if you give them feedback about what you're learning as you go along. So I think the transparency, the feedback, and the being in it for the long term is the other thing. If you want to make a buck quickly now, there's some pretty easy ways to do it. It may not be good for people in the long term.
You've given us some bracing insights about what we can do better. I'm going to call up this guy named Rob Califf when he talked about what we can do with the clinical trial. This was a formative part of your contribution to the world of medicine, the large-scale clinical trial that produces evidence-based medicine that we rely on. Yet you're saying some bracing things and critical things about that. Can you elaborate a little bit about this?
Yeah, I just got screwed up early in my career because I came along and someone asked me to run the cardiac care unit. At the time, we didn't know what caused heart attacks. 50, 60-year-old men were routinely dropping over dead from heart attacks. Everyone was smoking cigarettes, very high rates. And an enterprising cardiologist did an angiogram and showed it was blood clots in the coronary arteries, and the race was on to develop treatments that worked. And for some strange reason, it became the norm all around the world to enter people into randomized trials. So we could do these very big randomized trials very quickly, get the answer, and move on. And the risk of being dead now if you have a heart attack is less than half of what it was when we started because of this rapid learning system using randomization to get the right answer. Because most of what we tried actually didn't work. People have forgotten about that. Most of our trials, the treatment wasn't effective, even though we thought it should be. But for some reason, the whole thing got gummed up in bureaucracy and collecting. Part of the problem was at the time, medical records were all written on paper, so you had to create a separate enterprise of data systems to collect data separately from the clinical care. Very expensive. Then you had to fly nurses around in airplanes to check to make sure the records all matched. It's all, amazing amounts of bureaucratic human labor. The result is that even in cardiology, 85% of our major recommendations are not based on high quality evidence, and that's the best there is. God bless you. My little brother's an orthopedic surgeon. God bless you if you need orthopedic surgery. It does a lot of good, but it's less than 5% of the major recommendations there are based on high quality evidence. So we need a different evidence generation system. I'm very excited that people in this room can come together and produce something that's far superior with much more rapid learning. But we have to, I call it God's gift of randomization. I don't think that just analyzing our way with a bunch of data, because of all of the complex biases that are involved, is enough.
About that evidence generation, are we trying to have it both ways, that we want to make it easily accessible to produce this information, to use smartphones, other types of activity trackers? At the same time, these aren't medical grade units. So are we trying to get more data, but at the same time, we cannot fully trust the quality of that data?
I mean, I think we got this right at the FDA, and it's playing out, since I've left, I think in a very pleasing way. I mean, basically, if you're otherwise healthy and there's a device that's meant to remind you to exercise or count your heart rate or stuff, that's fine. That's a consumer device. Doesn't have to be perfect. It'll get better and better. If you've got heart failure and you're at risk of dropping over dead, that device needs to be accurate. And I think we need to have the discipline and rigor to perfect the engineering to the point where it really can be reliable. And it's not so easy, I think we're finding, but I'm very optimistic. I think we will be able to do it. But it also means that we've got to involve like teams of people who really understand biomedical data and how it's used in the clinical setting, working with the engineers very closely so that the information can really be used to inform good decisions. And I think the FDA is going to need to look carefully at a lot of the algorithms when they first come out, which will be a fascinating exercise.
I would like to give the opportunity for the audience to ask questions. Brian.
Sure. So first, as a Pats fan, speaking to a Duke fan, expression I'll remind you of: they hate us because they ain't us. Okay. All right. So this is a little bit off the topic, but I'm sure you'll have an opinion on it. What do you think are, and this is more of a business question, hospitals today? I believe healthcare, hospitals in particular, are headed for a major disruption from a business model perspective. What are 2 or 3 things that you think hospitals need to start doing today from a business perspective to sustain themselves or to continue to provide the value that they provide for the population?
There was some interesting traffic on Twitter today about this related to an article that came out. So I would make a big division between urban areas and rural areas. It turns out that rural hospitals need to become community centers, basically. If you look at rural America, where this demise that I talked about is happening in terms of health statistics, it's closely related to the economics and loss of jobs and all that sort of stuff. It turns out at Duke we are affiliated with a group called LifePoint, which is a for-profit system that buys rural hospitals. And what's happening to those hospitals when they're well managed is they are sort of a way station. They take care of people who need short stays or have sort of not quite nursing home care yet, but also become community centers because the main employment in these towns is education and healthcare. And so I think the rural hospitals need to be transformed. My friend Patrick Conway just wrote a great JAMA editorial about the pathway for rural hospitals. Urban hospitals, I think, can't help themselves right now, and there's no amount of efficiency in the current payment scheme that they can do that will fix the problem. This is just my opinion. So it's fair to say they ought to continue to to work more and more on getting more efficient, implementing decision support, et cetera. But fundamentally, what's needed in a different payment system is to keep people out of the hospital, and then to optimize the use of the hospital using very high-grade intelligence. Here I'll just combine Clayton Christensen's focus factory thing. It ought to be that you stay out of a hospital unless you really need one. Then when you really need one, you ought to go to a place that's really good at what it does for the problem that you have, even if you have to travel, which is a disruption to the cultural things that we've just been talking about. But there's no way that in the current payment scheme, hospitals can afford to make that transition. So they're going to have to be forced to do it. And I hope that a role of Silicon Valley here with all of its financial prowess as well as information will be to help push the country to the transition it needs away from fee-for-service medicine, which I think is the culprit.
Hi, my name is Bridget. I also work with hospitals with Brian, so I have another hospitals-related question. But from what I know about machine learning and artificial intelligence is that you get better if you have bigger data sets and they're more interconnected and bigger, larger data sets. So there have been great moves to do that. But what I observe with hospitals is that it's super siloed data that lives in every different spot. And while we have made major inroads with digitizing data, it's not connected to anything. And data about our most vulnerable and needy populations actually live in a lot of these hospitals, which arguably are not technology companies, are not led by technology people or people who understand data, and again have these siloed data structures. So what can be the next big step to connect data to allow for machine learning algorithms to get smarter that aren't just kind of like pockets of success, that are really scaled, interconnective systems that allow for better evidence-based medicine for your little brother?
Yeah, so a couple of things. I completely agree with you about the nature of the problem. But I would urge a couple of changes in terminology. So it's not, America's coalescing into, it's actually quantifiable. It's a little over 650 health systems now that own the hospitals. It's been said, and I haven't seen the data yet, but a pretty reliable person told me if you look, there are about 150 of these health systems that care for about 70% of the American population now. And all of them have a business interest in, as you know, in aggregating their information into data, whatever the right term is, warehouses, lakes, pools, all that stuff, so that they can conduct their business and stay viable financially. Because of fee-for-service, the data they're aggregating tends to be not quite accurate, but it's still usable for a lot of things. So I don't want to sound totally cynical about that. But the culprit is they think there's great value in that data, and so they're not very willing to share it or give it up, often under the guise of HIPAA and privacy issues and concerns, which are real but shouldn't prohibit this. I'd say the second thing is in our center at Duke for data science, I personally think we need to quit just saying machine learning. We need to say quantitative methods, because a lot of what needs to be done doesn't require machine learning. It's just if you had the data. And so what I would do is focus a lot on the curation of the information to get it in usable form, and then have teams of people who use the information for the purpose using the right quantitative method for that purpose. And then what I'd say is we've got to break down the data silos, and I think our best weapon there is going to be patient advocacy groups. We really worked on this in the Obama administration, as you know, to try to get over the hurdle. If there had just been another 4 years, a lot of things would be different. But we couldn't get there. And we are doing things, as I said, like the PCRF, Sentinel. In PCRF, we got a third of America's health systems sharing their data.
Can you explain what PCRF is?
It's a People-Centered Research Foundation. It was created through funding from PCORI, which is paid for out of a tax on the Medicare fund and insurance companies. And there's a board that oversees it, which is industry, academia, government, the usual suspects. The goal is to do research using aggregate information. But what you want is something even much more granular than what we have in that. But we're showing that given the right incentives, people can share data on a massive scale. But I think actually the place to divert right now for a period of time is this thing that we were talking about, getting the social rules right and having people understand what the rules of the game need to be so it can be shared. Because technically I don't think it's a big issue right now. It's all cultural.
One of the dominant ways to get paid in the research and development of drugs and of devices is to charge for it based on a monopoly. Do you see our intellectual property laws as well calibrated to the human health space today and in the future?
I'd say the general principle, I don't know another way to do it than to say you've got to have some period of exclusivity to recoup the cost of development. When you say calibrated, that's a really important term because it's different for different it should be different for different circumstances. And I don't know that if the current duration of time is right for the circumstances that we're currently in. A simple way, I think what you're referring to, obviously the more rigorous we are about what gets on the market, the more, I actually want to argue with myself here, but in theory, the more you'd have to spend on development to get it right. But I would argue if we use the technology that you guys are developing and automate the research systems, we could radically reduce the cost of development because the biggest costs now are the late phase clinical trials. But then you ask the question, if you have a drug that's life-saving and you have a legal monopoly, which is a deal with society to give you a chance to recoup the cost, how do you set a price on that when the only way people can survive is if they get that drug? And that's where I think we've got it not right at this point. So you can think of about that either as length of time in which you have that, or some other mechanism of setting prices that's more fair to people who are vulnerable. So I think this is, but let's also now think about the big thing looming. Assuming we solve all the short-term problems, we got Alzheimer's and other long-term chronic diseases where we'll know that people are at risk long before they have the first symptom. So how do you develop a treatment and price it right when it would be preemptive and worth a whole lot, but you got to pay for it up front? The hepatitis C drug situation is a good example of that. If you actually cost that out over a lifetime, it's a pretty good deal at the price, but the fact that people have to pay it up front at one time meant that whole state Medicaid programs would have gone bankrupt had they made it available.
And what is the price right now?
It's coming down, but it's in the tens of thousands per treatment. But as you know, for some rare diseases and types of cancers, $300,000 or $400,000 a year. I think that's what you're getting at. So I don't think we have it right, and I think it's another area where we need, once we get adults in the room in Washington and at universities, we need to have continue those discussions.
I have customers in healthcare trying to solve some of these problems, and as we work together with them and they have an interest in partnering with Google, how do we decide whether it's the right conversation to have with you guys, or what are the criteria, or how do we determine that process?
So it's a little hard to come into this environment, I hate to tell you, from a structured, it's really stark for me because I'll step into my office in North Carolina at Duke University. It's very hierarchical. I've got this big staff that makes everything work, and people know who I am, and there's a funnel of information that comes out to me in my job. Here I arrived out at Verily. I'm in a little glass cage with another guy who's dean of a medical school. We're sharing an office, and I'm just another one of the people. So, and then you say, how do decisions get made? And this is a place where I think the software culture has a lot to offer in terms of the flatness, but it won't work it won't work like a software culture to make it work. And based on everything I've seen, I think this is a major topic that the enterprise alphabet needs to spend some time on. It's good to have some internal competition. Harvard is probably one of the best examples of a place where you can go 100 yards away and see people competing on the same thing. But to the outside world, if you don't offer some cohesive approach, it's hard enough for them just to get by right now, as you know. So I think we need to do some work to figure this out, and I hope I can be helpful with that.
Well, this has been wonderful. Thank you so much for coming down and listening to Rob, and great questions. And please come up and visit us on the 12th floor at Verily here in Cambridge if you want to continue the conversation. And this was a great experience for us, and we hope to replicate it in the future. Thank you.